When I was a child and also a teenager, I had this habit, this time-filling kind of attentiveness-related habit that also mixed in a really great way with my personal brand of creativity, of taking a sheet of notebook paper or copy paper, some kind of standard sheet of paper, standard size, 8 by 11.5 or whatever it is, and I would work on that one piece of paper for however long it took to fill every possible centimeter of space with something. A doodle, quotes, lots and lots of song lyrics. I've always been so deeply invested in music, that kind of thing. I would fill every possible space available on this originally blank sheet of paper until it was basically marred with the black ink. Pretty much always black ink. I was a goth kid in high school, so black ink it definitely was as I got older too. And I'll never forget. And when I say I'll never forget, that really means something, because in 2017 I had a near fatal accident that resulted in a traumatic brain injury, skull fracture, some brain clots or bleeds or something like that. Really dramatic, really traumatizing for my brain. And I lost the majority of my long-term memories, and my ability to form short-term memories was significantly limited by that accident. On top of that, when I say I'll never forget, and I say that that really means something, on top of that, I have a newer neurological disorder that is progressive in my daily life, and one of the results of that newer neurological disorder, and when I say newer, I mean it's been a few years now. One of the consequences, though, of that newer disorder is that my ability to form short-term memory is basically none. Constantly introduce myself to people I've met many times, can have a conversation with you and forget it 20 minutes later or less. Sometimes I can't tell you what I ate for breakfast right after I finish eating it. So that, coupled with the existing injury to my brain, when I say I'll never forget, yeah, okay, it means something. So back to my pages that I filled every single space up of. Basically, the thing I'll never forget, or I'm 99.999666333% sure I'll never forget, because I have not forgotten yet, is that one day, like I said, this was both a time-filling / attentiveness / creativity thing for me, if you want to add the third element in there as well. And one day, I'm sitting in my high school science class. It's taught by a man, and I remember his name, but I'm not going to say it. The fact that I remember his name says a lot as well, if I'm being honest. But it was being taught by a man, a teacher, that admittedly we already had a strained relationship. I can't remember well enough to tell you if he genuinely just disliked me right away from the start of the year or whenever I met him. I can tell you that he genuinely disliked me. Now, whether or not I'm the reason he disliked me, I honestly can't remember, so I want to be upfront about that. Maybe I did something like the first day of class that was super rude or disruptive. That's not really my vibe as a person, to be rude and disruptive. However, I am a late diagnosed autistic, and so I'm realizing as an adult in hindsight that a lot of the things that seem pretty standard to me, some might find disruptive, disturbing, disrespectful, that sort of thing. So maybe it's as simple as that. Maybe I did something very early on in this man's class that he found inappropriate. But the point is, we had a strained relationship by the time the story I'm telling you took place. So yeah, I'll never forget. I'm sitting in his class one day. He's talking about something sciencey, because it was science. Couldn't tell you what he was talking about. Don't remember a whole lot about that class, except that I was one of those kids that refused to dissect the turtle. But that was because I had a bunch of pet turtles at home and I was really struggling with that. That sort of activism maybe did not persist with me, though. So perhaps I was just being a little difficult as well, my real feelings about turtles aside. But I'm sitting in his class, and since part of this action was an attentiveness thing for me, I'm doing it now even, I'm working on a color by number while I'm telling the story. Since that was part of it for me, I had this sheet of paper that I had been working on. Sometimes it would take hours, sometimes it would take days, depending. But I had the sheet of paper that I was working on, and it had been pretty filled out. It was getting closer, to being full. And I was listening to what he was saying. That's kind of the part of the point. It gives me something, I guess maybe, I don't really understand why it's helpful to me, but maybe it's just that it gives me something to do with my hands, something to look at other than the thing that I'm supposed to be paying direct attention to, because direct attention can be really uncomfortable for me. Regardless of the reason, it's a useful practice for me. I was doing it as that kind of useful practice, and so I was listening. Don't remember what was talked about that day, but I know I was listening as I was doing my doodling / writing and that sort of thing on my piece of paper that I was filling up. And I'll never forget, he comes up the aisle that I'm sitting on, and he sort of walks slowly down towards me, and I could kind of sense almost immediately that he was walking toward me. You know, he had a goal, and his goal was to get into my space. And I tried to ignore that gut instinct. My gut instinct has really always been very useful and spot on. But I tried to ignore that, and I kept listening to what he was saying, because obviously he's walking down the aisle and he's lecturing still. And once he gets to my desk space, once he gets in my little, you know, high school chair bubble, he pauses, as I had almost imagined and expected him to do from the moment he started walking down the aisle. Again, we already have a strained relationship, so we've had more than one uncomfortable interaction at this point. And I'm still just, you know, writing whatever I'm writing at that moment, or doodling whatever I'm doodling at that moment in the space on the page I'm working on. And I'm trying very hard as I'm still trying to listen, but now he's distracting me by being way too into my personal space. As I'm continuing to listen, or try to listen at this point, I could just feel his eyes boring into, like, my head, I guess, and then also the piece of paper that I'm working on. Because, again, I knew almost immediately that not only was he coming down the aisle to interact with me, potentially, but it was probably about the fact that I was doodling on a piece of paper / writing on a piece of paper while he was talking. Because, you know, God forbid anyone do anything other than listen to him, right? We all sometimes struggle with that kind of, I guess, egotistical sort of behavior. It's a natural thing, I think. I don't even think of it as being egotistical. But anyway, so I knew in my heart of hearts that he was there for me, and he had come into my space deliberately to look at what I was doing, and most likely to complain about it. And so at this point, I'm trying to listen to what he's saying. He's slowing down. He's obviously getting ready to interrupt himself. And it's getting harder, but I'm trying really hard to just continue what I'm doing and listen to what he's saying, even though I just know he's about to reprimand me in some way. And then he does finally stop talking, interrupts himself by stopping, you know, the lecture that he's working on at that moment. And he doesn't ask. He just picks up the piece of paper I'm working on while I'm writing on it. So, you know, I gotta, like, jump back so I don't end up just drawing some kind of random line, you know. He picks up the piece of paper, and so I just pause and kind of wait. He's no longer lecturing. He's no longer talking. He's looking at the piece of paper. And I'm sitting there uncomfortable as hell, but waiting for the reprimand about not paying attention to come. One, I could have argued against him, like, I am paying attention, I'm just doing both things at the same time. I wasn't planning on doing that. I was just going to take the reprimand and be done with it, because I just didn't have it in my energy, I guess, that day to have some kind of really deep or energy-sucking disagreement with this particular man. And, you know, he takes a moment or two and he looks over the piece of paper, which feels invasive because on top of music lyrics and doodling, like I said, there was writing on there as well, original writing, usually. Little tiny tidbits of poems or lines for future poems and that sort of thing. It's all mixed in with the other stuff that's not my own. And so there's a bit of vulnerability to these papers that I'm making too, because they involve, like I said, creativity, and they involve some of my original work, at least in short form. So yeah, but this time I'm very, very uncomfortable, even more so than when I began. And I'm feeling a little invaded. And yeah, so I'm just sitting there waiting for, you know, the shoe to drop, the hammer to fall, for him to just get on to me, I guess, reprimand me, lecture me, whatever. And this is where we get to the part that makes this something I can lead with I'll never forget. And it's that I'll never forget because he didn't reprimand me. He didn't come at me from an educator's space. He chose instead to look over my piece of paper, do that kind of teachery thing that you do, and I know it well because I've done it. I was in education for years, the college level, but in education. And, you know, he does that kind of teachery psychic thing where he requires eye contact with you without actually saying anything. So, you know, slowly I look up, and I'm not a big fan of eye contact. Again, late diagnosed autistic, this is not so surprising in hindsight, but I'm not a big fan of these direct eye contact conversations. And he looks at me for a moment after we have eye contact, so we have this brief, but to me it feels like a million years of sustained eye contact, where I already know that, you know, this thing is coming, or I think I know it's coming. And he says to me, kind of like glancing with his eyes at the paper and turning it around a couple times for show, because I didn't write all in one line, I wrote in different directions. It was very much collage-like in style. And he says to me, why would anyone waste their time on something like this? And he's just got this like disgusted, you're an idiot, this is literally the most worthless thing I've ever seen created look on his face and tone in his voice. And that is why I will never forget, or I'm almost certain I will never forget, even as everything else in my brain progresses and gets more difficult. I am so sure it'll be a long time, if ever, before I forget that one, because this teacher that I admittedly already had problems with, this teacher looked at something of mine that was clearly something I had put a lot of effort into. And he could have simply just said, you need to pay attention when I'm speaking in class. Put this away. He could have just done that. As a teacher, that was justifiable, even if I disagreed, even if I thought it was helpful to me to be able to do this other thing while he was speaking. I think it helped me retain the information better. But instead of just doing the standard teacher sort of power move that was totally justifiable, he chose to take something that was obviously vulnerable for me, and he chose to hurt me in a personal way. You know, he took something that obviously had my own personal brand of creativity in it. He took something that was not scientific. He took something that was obviously driven and fueled by passion, even if it wasn't the kind of passion that he could understand. He took something very personal, and he made it seem worthless, and he made it seem idiotic, and in that way, he hurt me personally, at a personal level. It wasn't about my behavior in his class. It wasn't about my performance on a test or a paper. None of that is what this was about. This was about hurting me personally, something that was special and important to me. I'll never forget that. I never will, because it's not the first time it had happened in my life. It certainly happens to everyone many times. It doesn't always come from somebody with so much authority over you, but you know, everyone goes through that same particular kind of thing, different situations, but the same basic issue of being hurt about something very personal to them or something vulnerable for them or both. And he chose to do that instead of all the other justifiable routes he could have taken. And I can't remember exactly if I stopped doing that particular creative, attentive, time-filling practice after that, at least for a while. I suspect I probably did, though, because I had a similar issue in my life, not with him, as a kid, when I was first toying around with drawing mostly, like artistic things, and someone basically told me I sucked, and I just never even tried again until I was an older adult, like literally in the last year or two. So I suspect I, especially with my particular level of emotion that's invested in things that I do and say and feel, I suspect I probably stopped, at least for a while. I suspect he hurt me that deeply. And I'll never forget it. And I hope that people out in the world are trying to be people that aren't like that, you know, that aren't for no other reason than hatred of someone or dislike or your own insecurities or whatever it may be. I hope that when people are trying hard not to be that kind of person that just yanks something important out from under people for no good reason, essentially. And that is my tale. That is my story. I don't even know if it really had a point, but thank you for listening to my TED Talk. And I hope you, whatever passions you may have, I hope you pursue them, and I hope people support you. And if they don't support you, I hope they at least keep their fucking mouth shut.